Welcome to the Research Culture Uncovered podcast, where in every episode we explore what is research culture and what should it be. You'll hear thoughts and opinions from a range of contributors to help you change research culture into what you want it to be.
Hi, it's Nick, Open Research Advisor based in the library here at the University of Leeds. Today, I'm very excited to be talking to Marcus Munafò, Professor of Biological Psychology and a MRC, that's Medical Research Council, investigator at the University of Bristol, where he is also Associate Pro Vice Chancellor for Research Culture. Marcus completed his PhD at the University of Southampton and was a postdoctoral researcher at the Universities of Oxford and of Pennsylvania before joining the University of Bristol. His primary research interests are on the impacts of health behaviours such as smoking and drinking on physical and mental health outcomes. However, today we'll be mostly talking about the UK Reproducibility Network, which he co-founded in 2019 and is currently chair of the UKRN Supervisory Board. So welcome to the podcast, Marcus, and thank you for taking the time to talk to us.
Hi there, thanks for having me.
So obviously we're going to be talking about UKRN, as we'll refer to it for short, the UK Reproducibility Network. But first of all, I heard you speaking at the House of Commons Science, Innovation and Technology Committee, so I'd be interested in how that experience was, in the corridors of power and how that sort of works, how the process went. So you gave evidence, I think, to that committee with Dorothy Bishop, is that right?
That's right, and also another person who gave evidence at that committee from UKRN, or the UKRN family, if you like, was Jess Butler, who was at the time the local network lead at the University of Aberdeen. We can talk later, I guess, about the structure of UKRN, but when this inquiry came up, it was on research reproducibility, and we thought, well, that's obviously something that we would have something to say about. And so our different constituent parts, if you like, our local networks, our institutional members, our stakeholder engagement group, all of those bits of UKRN submitted written evidence, and a few of us were then invited to come and give oral evidence in the Houses of Parliament, and that was quite exciting. So I was one of those people. Jess was another. Dorothy Bishop, who was chair of our advisory board at the time, was the third. And there were obviously many other people who gave oral evidence as well. And it was a great opportunity to speak to the part of our parliamentary system, if you like, that is tasked with focusing on specific issues and making recommendations to government as to how they can change things in a positive way. So there are many different committees and groups that exist within our parliamentary system. There are all-party parliamentary groups, but those are really just discussion groups. They don't do any real business, if you like. And then there are the select committees, of which the Science, Innovation and Technology Committee is one. And that's where the real business happens. They're cross-party and they scrutinise particular issues within their remit and actually do that very well. One of the things I was impressed by was the extent to which these MPs, who are not, for the most part, academic scientists, researchers, or who had much direct experience of that system themselves, were able to ask quite on-point questions about issues of publication bias, incentive structures, that kind of thing. So it was a really good opportunity to bring a particular perspective and get that in front of this particular committee, who could then write a report, which they did, that made recommendations to government, and then the government responded to that report. And I found it really exciting, to be honest. I mean, I guess it's the kind of thing that is a little bit intimidating because, as you say, you're in the corridors of power. You are walking past the House of Commons as you go to the room that the Select Committee is meeting in. I had to wear a suit. I mean, I didn't have to, I guess, but I chose to. And that's not something I do very often. I didn't wear a tie. I only do that when I'm kind of in trouble. But it was an exciting opportunity for me, and because those meetings are recorded, it meant that we were also able to disseminate the oral evidence that we gave via our various social media channels to our wider community. So that helped in terms of the transparency of the process, because of course I was in part, I suppose, speaking as myself, but also as best I could representing UKRN in the same way that Dorothy and Jess and others were when they gave their evidence. So it was good to be able to show the world, and in particular our community, what we were saying on their behalf, if you like.
Yeah, and I have watched the recording. It's still available, I think. I confess. So I did watch the recording of you and some of the other ones as well. I confess I haven't read the report in full. Was the report what you hoped it was? What were the conclusions of that report? Did it sort of...
It was quite a broad-ranging report, and there were some good points that were made. There were some points that I think were well meant but didn't appreciate the sort of complexity of the challenges. So around, for example, the short-term funding that is often available to early career researchers and the challenges that creates, what we sometimes talk about as precarity. There were proposals there to, for example, extend the duration of contracts, but actually doing that on the ground is much more complicated than the report allowed for. So I think it was a very well-intentioned report. I think there were some good recommendations in there. They encouraged, for example, wider uptake of registered reports, and in particular, getting funders and publishers' journals to work in partnership to incentivize registered reports and make them easier to engage with in those disciplines where that's appropriate. And that was one of our recommendations. So it was good to see that in the final report. And on the back of that, we started to have conversations with funders like Wellcome, for example, about their appetite for bringing in that partnership model that we've been piloting with Cancer Research UK and a few different journals.
Yeah, well, and as I say, it is still available, so I'll make sure they are linked in the show notes for this if colleagues want to follow them up. But I guess to go back to the beginning, just perhaps a bit of an overview of your sort of academic background and where your interest in these issues in reproducibility, or sometimes called a crisis. I'm not sure if you use that terminology yourself. That issues of reproducibility and open research. What's your sort of background and interest in that?
So it goes back a long way, actually. Although to some extent, I've only just realised that after the fact, because whilst I was in my PhD, I didn't have the language really to describe it in the terms that I would today. The crisis point is an interesting one. I've always tried to avoid the use of the word crisis for a couple of reasons. One is that it makes it sound like everything has suddenly come to a head, and I'm not sure that's true. There have been issues around how well we do research for as long as we've been doing research, and it also suggests that there's a problem to be fixed, and if we can fix it, then we're done and it'll all be rosy. And of course, I don't think that's true, because the world continues to evolve, and to some extent we need to be continuously reflecting on how we work, whether we can do things better, how we can adapt to a changing research system, new modes of scholarly communication, all of that kind of thing. And I just think the crisis narrative brings the focus in too narrowly and suggests that it's an acute problem that can be fixed in isolation. And I don't think that's the right way to think about it. My own sort of journey into this, if you like, when I look back on my career, actually started during my PhD, because the first study that I tried to run was a replication study of a finding that looked absolutely nailed on, if you believe the published literature. And that's always a good way to start. Just see if you can get that sort of foundational experiment to work. And if you can, then you build your PhD rather, on the back of that. And it didn't work. The finding didn't replicate. And so I thought, oh my God, I'm obviously a terrible researcher. I'm not cut out for this. I can't get this really basic finding to replicate. And actually, the reality was that the finding was really flaky, and that the published literature had been distorted by publication bias and perhaps a little bit of p-hacking or whatever that went into those published papers. And I was fortunate that there was a senior academic that I bumped into who said to me, oh, actually, everyone knows that finding's flaky. No one can replicate that finding. And that was interesting at the time, because it made me realize that there's more to academic research than just what you see in the published literature. In other words, the published literature is just a sliver of what happens, and a very unrepresentative sliver. So that was the starting point. Then in my postdoctoral research, we were looking at genetic variants that predicted response to treatment amongst people who were trying to stop smoking. So how well people respond to nicotine patches, that kind of thing. And this was in the days when you had to genotype manually. So you're in a lab with pipettes and you had to choose a specific genetic variant that you wanted to investigate. So this was in the days before you could look across the whole genome using a genotyping chip. And because that was time consuming and expensive, you wanted to select the genetic variant with the most chance of being associated with the thing you were interested in. So I started doing meta-analyses to look at all of these genetic association studies that have been published, and noticed that there were some interesting patterns in the data that suggested there was something else going on than what you would imagine from the sort of conventional model of how science is meant to work. For example, what has become known as the decline effect was really apparent. In other words, that first published studies tend to show larger effect sizes than subsequent studies. So your first finding tends to report an inflated effect size, and then when replication studies come after that, the effect sizes tend to go down over time. And there are reasons to do with that that are well understood, to do with the application of a threshold for claiming discovery when you're using statistical tests. But the point is that that also piqued my interest in terms of suggesting that there was more to how science really worked than we were taught, if you like, as undergraduates, as PhD students, and so on. So it was an accumulation of things like that, and an appreciation that this particular field that I was working in was really flaky in terms of the robustness of the findings, that got me interested in these issues of research quality, reproducibility. And it was around that time that John Ioannidis published his famous paper on why most published research findings are false. And that was a real anchor for me, because it made me realize that I wasn't the only person who was seeing these issues and thinking about these issues. Because when I raised these issues to colleagues, it was often received as a kind of problem that they would rather went away, and they didn't really want to be talking about it. So when there was that high-profile article published, it reassured me that actually there really was something here that we should be looking at closely and potentially doing something about.
Right, thanks. And I suppose just to address the point that you are a psychologist, there's an awful lot of psychologists, I think, in this area, which I've discussed before with so my colleague, I did I'm sure you know, Professor Darrell O'Connor is a psychologist here, who's our institutional lead for UKRN. He's also a psychologist, and there's quite a lot of psychologists sort of interested in this area, but it's not just an issue, is it, for psychology? I think that's one of the things we need to stress.
Well, that's true. I mean, I had quite an unusual career path, I guess, in that I went from experimental psychology as an undergraduate to more applied psychology as a postgraduate, then to public health and primary care, then to clinical pharmacology, then to psychiatry, and then back to experimental psychology, but working with epidemiologists as I do still. So I've worked across quite a broad range of biomedical domains. And what I've noticed is that really the same issues exist across those different subdisciplines, if you like, and also that different subdisciplines all do something well and can learn from each other. And I think that extends beyond just the biomedical and life sciences. One of the things that I'm increasingly interested in is how we can more generally learn across disciplines. And I can say a bit more about that if that's interesting. But in terms of psychology being the dominant discipline in this debate, to some extent at least, I think in part that's simply because the issues that we're dealing with are issues of human behavior, how people respond to incentives, the cognitive biases that we bring to our work, the extent to which questionable research practices, for example, might in part be driven by confirmation bias and just the desire to find something in our work, which is, well motivated, but we're human, we're fallible, and therefore we can be led astray if we're not careful. All of those are issues of human behavior, and that's what psychologists study. So I think the reasons why psychologists are at the forefront to some extent of addressing these issues is simply because the drivers of these issues are our subject matter.
Yeah, and before we get on to UKRN, just you mentioned a couple of things there, just if we could perhaps define. So you mentioned questionable research practices, and you also mentioned p-hacking. Could you sort of give us a bit of an overview of what you mean by?
Sure. So questionable research practices are just those research practices that are sufficiently widespread and seen as normative that people wouldn't necessarily regard them as fraud. And they're often well-intentioned, but serve collectively to undermine the quality of the work that we do. So, for example, we're often told you should explore your data, and that's no bad thing, to genuinely explore patterns in data that you've generated to develop new hypotheses that you can then go and test in a separate study, for example. That's an entirely appropriate thing to do. But if you explore your data, then calculate a p-value, and then claim that what you found was something that you were looking for, or that you have made some kind of discovery when in fact you've just generated a hypothesis, that is problematic because it's circular to some extent. You've explored, you seem to have found something, but of course you did because you explored. And if you explore hard enough, you'll find something eventually. It doesn't mean that it's real. And p-hacking is a version of that where you simply run lots of statistical tests and then only report the one of the 100 that you've run that gives you a small p-value and an ostensibly interesting finding. So there are lots of these behaviors that are not outright fraud, generally not driven by malicious intent or a desire to game the system consciously, at least, but arise from maybe the incentive structures that we work within, the priority that we give to making discoveries, for example. And again, collectively, they just serve to dramatically, I think, undermine the quality of research that we produce.
Yeah, no, great, thank you. So yeah, I just thought I'd pick up on that definition. So to UKRN, the UK Reproducibility Network, perhaps could you give us so you're a co-founder along with who, I suppose, would be my first question. Who else was involved?
Well, there were several of us that were involved in the discussions that led to the formation of UKRN, but really I would say that the key people would be people like Lara Fortunato, who's an anthropologist at Oxford, Chris Chambers, who's a neuroscientist at Cardiff. Dorothy Bishop was heavily involved in those early conversations and a real advocate for what we were trying to do. Malcolm Macleod, who's a neurologist at the University of Edinburgh, was another person who was involved from early on. But I think you can trace much of the origins back to a methods workshop that we were running, funded by the BBSRC several years ago now, some years before we actually launched, where Chris and Lara and Dorothy and myself started talking about how we could bring together all of this energy that we were seeing for changing how we work in order to improve the quality of the research that we produce, because much of that was happening at the grassroots level and it wasn't being joined up with what was happening at an institutional level and what was happening at a funder level and so on.
Mm-hmm. And so you started UKRN in 2019, and I suppose one of the things that really strikes me is just how quickly it's become such an important organisation for the sector. You know, how's that happened, and why do you think? Has it just hit the zeitgeist? Is it?
There's a bit of that. I think there are a couple of things I'd say. One is that actually there was a lot of work that went into launching it in the first place. So what people see over the last 5 years is really only half of the time that we've spent getting it to this point. Another place where you can sort of pinpoint the origins of UKRN is a meeting at the Academy of Medical Sciences in 2015, when funders like BBSRC, Wellcome, MRC came together to address these issues. So this was 10 years after the publication of Johnny Ionidis' article on why most published research findings are false. It had taken that long for funders to get to the point that they recognized that there was something here to talk about and to address. And so they convened this quite small meeting to talk about the issues and potential solutions. And that was the point at which we, myself, Dorothy, Lara, Chris, and so on, started to lobby funders, saying to them, we can help you with this. We can bring together researchers themselves to be part of the solution, but we need some support from you. That will take time, that will take money. We'll need, support for the costs that go with that. And that started a conversation that went on for 3 or 4 years. We got funders, publishers, learned societies into a room in Bristol in 2018 on the back of those conversations that had happened since that 2015 meeting. And that was the point at which many of the funders said, we will all give you a small amount of money to kick this thing off. We went with a proposal for what UKRN, as it became, might look like. They agreed to support that in a modest way, individually, but because there were enough of them, that converted to a sufficient amount for us to appoint an administrator, set up a website, those kinds of things. And that was then what led to the launch in 2019. So there's a great quote that revolutions happen very slowly and then all at once. And it feels a little bit like that. There was a lot of preparatory work that went in. People like Dorothy and Chris and myself had been talking about these issues since 2005. Right. We've been lobbying funders since 2015. We launched in 2019. And since then, things have moved very quickly. I think exactly because it was happening at the point where there was all of this grassroots energy, when the funders were starting to pay attention to these issues, when the publishers were recognizing that they had a role to play in potential solutions. So the timing was ideal, and that meant that uptake was even more rapid than we expected it to be.
Mm-hmm. And can you tell us a little bit about the structure and the membership model and that kind of thing? So we at the University of Leeds are now members, and but there is just give us a bit of a sort of overview of how the membership and the structure of the organisation work.
Sure. Well, the main thing that we try to bring is a framework, a structure that allows for coordination, if you like, horizontally and vertically across the research system, and brings together all the major constituent parts of that research system in a way that allows for collaborative approaches and solutions and allows for different voices to be heard, if you like. So we have three main constituent parts. We have our local networks. So these are informal, self-organizing groups of researchers that come together to form communities of practice on the ground, focused on issues of research rigor, transparency, open research, and so on. Those are led by local network leads, one or more, at individual institutions, and we have those at about 70 institutions across the UK at the moment. And many of those local network leads are early career researchers. Then we have institutional members, and institutions, universities can join UKRN as institutions, and they appoint a senior academic who works at the senior management level, focusing on issues of hiring and promotion practices and training and so on. And we have those at about 40 institutions in the UK at the moment. And the ideal model would be that every institution would have a local network lead and an institutional lead, both working in partnership, advocating for each other, challenging each other, one representing the voice of the grassroots research community, not just researchers, but technicians, people working in library teams, all of those involved in the research process. And then the institutional lead would be there holding senior management's feet to the fire, making sure that they lived up to the various, for example, concordats that they've signed up to, and the fact that they've signed up to be a member of UKRN. So the institutional leads are our second major part. And then we have our stakeholder engagement group, where we have representatives of funders, publishers, learned societies, professional bodies like ARMA and Research Libraries UK, government laboratories, all of the other sectoral organizations that are part of the research system. And what that structure allows for is coordination within and between those three different elements. So our local network leads come together on an annual retreat every year to form a national community of practice and share ideas and support each other. The same is true for institutional members. And we have our open research program that is largely working at the institutional level. And then we have partnerships between funders and publishers. For example, I mentioned the Registered Reports Funding Partnership between Cancer Research UK and journals from Springer Nature, PLOS and Wiley. Those are examples of within group coordination, but we can also link across those groups. So when UKRI was setting up the UK Committee on Research Integrity, they were interested in learning what the grassroots community felt was required of that committee. And so we were able to put some of our local network leads directly in touch with that group. And I also mentioned Jess Butler, the local network lead at Aberdeen, who gave oral evidence to the Select Committee's inquiry into reproducibility. So that structure is really there to provide a framework for collaboration, coordination, and cooperative solutions.
And if colleagues are listening at universities that may be just still trying to get off the ground with the UKRN, what's the best way to go about that? Just get in touch with colleagues?
Just if you go to our website, so ukrn.org, there's a contact email address, and you can contact us and say that you are interested in setting up a local network, which is something that just happens organically, if you like, in that we support researchers on the ground to form these local networks, and we can provide them with support and resources to do that. Or if institutions want to join, that requires a degree of senior management buy-in, because we ask that the institutional lead has a certain amount of their time protected to deliver on their commitment to UKRN. So that is a slightly more formal process, but still relatively straightforward. No money changes hands, that helps. If you want to join the open research program, that's an additional step, but again, light touch. And if you are listening in and you're a funder or a publisher and you're not part of UKRN's stakeholder engagement group yet, then again, just contact us and we can walk you through the process. The terms of reference for UKRN are on our website and describe how each of these different groups works.
Yeah, my own first exposure, I think, to UKRN was through Reproducibility, the Reproducibility Journal Club, which I'd strongly recommend getting along to if there's one at your institution. I've learned a heck of a lot through reproducibility, and we've got quite a strong community here at Leeds, and I know, I'd really recommend that. So, sorry.
Can I just say, so reproducibility is a really interesting example. It's worth saying reproducibility is not something that UKRN initiated. It was an independent initiative set up by, at the time, PhD students at the University of Oxford. So Sam Parsons, Sophia Kruvel and Amy Orban. And we saw that as something that was very much aligned with what we as UKRN were trying to do. So we have supported reproducibility, and we partner with them. And we have a number of these initiatives that are also on our website that are independent of us, but where we are trying to, at the very least, amplify that activity. And in the case of reproducibility, before the pandemic, we were able to send out teapots and boxes of biscuits and tea bags and journal articles to local networks to set up a reproducibility. So there's a really nice synergy there between what we're doing at the local level and initiatives like reproducibility, Riot Science Club, and others.
Yeah. No, thanks for clarifying that, because I'm not sure I fully understood the background. We've got a teapot, though. We do have a UKRN teapot, which is why I associate it with UKRN. Slightly conscious of time. I'm always tend to talk too much on these on my podcast, always longer than anybody else's. But just wanted to touch on sort of disciplinary differences, which you did mention earlier. I mean, one of the things that I've heard discussed before is just the name, really, of the UK Reproducibility Network. It's not just, is it, about this issue of reproducibility? I mean, open research is much broader than that, and the issues vary across disciplines. I don't know if you could comment on that a little.
So that's definitely true, and it's something that we've wrestled with over the years. We, at that meeting that I mentioned in 2018, where we were talking about setting UKRN up, we wrestled with different possible names, and we landed on reproducibility as the one that was current at the time and the least worst of the options available, perhaps, but also relevant because the starting point for UKRN was very much in the sort of life and biomedical sciences space, as we've talked about. But since then, we've worked quite hard to broaden our relevance, if you like, across disciplines. And our current stance on that is that, and we may need to rebrand in a few years if we decide that what we're trying to do with the word reproducibility is just not going to get anywhere. But there are various ways in which you can define that word. You can define it quite narrowly. People talk about computational reproducibility and results reproducibility, and they will have very specific definitions. Or, as we try to do, you can step right back and say, actually, across the majority of disciplines, if not all disciplines, the process involves something along the lines of starting with some source material, and that could be numbers on a spreadsheet, it could be transcripts, it could be ancient texts, it could be images, it could be any number of different things. And then you apply a process to that, which is a process that flows from your own discipline and its underlying epistemology. And you then arrive at some kind of conclusion. And throughout that process, you're making choices, you're making assumptions, you're making decisions. And for us, reproducibility is about recognizing that process and making as much of that process as transparent as possible so that another person can come in and interrogate the choices that you made, the decisions that you made, and decide whether or not they agree with them. They would make different ones, see what happens if you apply a different decision at a particular point in the process in terms of what you end up with. And that's what we are trying to talk about when we talk about reproducibility, that broader transparency that lays bare the research process. And that then brings it quite close, I think, to open research, and also articulates how open research can be relevant across disciplines, because that starting material, if you like, you can think of as data in some sense. And it may not be numbers on a spreadsheet, but it's still the source material that you're working with, that you apply your process to. And so how can we then make those data fair? How can we lay bare all of the different decisions that we made throughout the process? And that's where I think, going back to a point I made earlier, we can learn across different disciplines. So quantitative researchers like to pretend that they're terribly objective, or like to think that they're terribly objective because they use numbers. But we know that presenting the same data to different quantitative researchers will generate different conclusions depending on the publication records of those different researchers. People bring their own perspective to their work and they interpret data through a particular lens. And people in the social sciences, in the arts and humanities, understand that extent to which we can shape our own conclusions because of our own background much more deeply, I think, than can quantitative researchers in the biomedical sciences. So we've got a lot to learn from each other. And to me, it's all part of that wider issue of transparency.
Yeah, no, and that's certainly what I enjoy about my job, because, often I say to people, I'm a layperson, essentially. I've got a bachelor's degree in English, which means I can read, but, so dealing with all sorts of different disciplines in across a big research intensive university and trying to see, you get sort of a bird's eye view of that almost. So just maybe slightly, well, actually, I just want to ask first, so if colleagues do want to find out more, you mentioned the website, and there's lots of resources on there, including case studies, aren't there? I think there's case studies from different, well, not so much case studies, but guidance for different subject areas, I think.
Well, we've got a whole load of different resources that hopefully people find useful. So we have primers on open research practices that are a sort of how-to guide if you haven't yet started engaging with open research, that are intended to get people off the ground in different aspects of open research. But then we've got some, I guess you'd call them vignettes of what open research looks like across different disciplines, from archaeology and the arts all the way through to physics. So it's meant to demonstrate the relevance of open research across disciplines and what that looks like in your discipline or a discipline that's very close to you. That was a project that was led by Emily Farron at the University of Surrey, who's one of our institutional leads, and was co-produced, if you like, with researchers on the ground working in those different disciplines.
Mm-hmm. And I've actually contributed a couple of primers myself, and there's one in that works, I think, for qualitative research. So again, it's one of those things collaboratively. If people have relevant experience or they'd like to contribute, you're always open to that, I would imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's that grassroots connection that we have, and that sort of underpinning that is provided by our local networks, that both gives us legitimacy, I think, when we go and speak to funders and other sectoral organizations, but also provides this enormous pool of energy and expertise that we can bring to bear when producing things like these primers.
Mm-hmm. No, that's great. Thanks, Marcus. And sort of coming to the end, I think, in terms of time, but the question I've got written down here, which I'll slightly rephrase perhaps slightly more provocative, as suggested by a colleague, but the question I've got written down is to what extent are we making progress in the UK and internationally, and what are the key challenges? I mean, I think we've covered a lot of that. I mean, we are making progress, I think, but the most likely provocative question might be, when do you think UKRN might be redundant? Would you like to see a time when it's no longer needed, or is that?
So I can see why you would think that's provocative, but that's exactly the question that we've been asking ourselves internally. We don't want to become one of those organizations that exists for the sake of existing or is always looking for a reason to exist. Rather, we want to ultimately make ourselves redundant because the things that we are advocating for have become standard practice. Mm-hmm. Now, the only caveat to that, well, two caveats. One is that probably isn't going to happen overnight. So, culture change takes time, behavior change takes time. Even if you look at something ostensibly quite straightforward like open access, we've been talking about that for 20 years and it's still not fully resolved. So we need to be realistic about the timescales involved in moving the needle on some of this stuff. But the second caveat is that part of what we bring through that structure that I've talked about is that ability to challenge. I talked about institutional leads holding senior management's feet to the fire. And we can also, as UKRN, hold funders' feet to the fire and bring challenge, constructive challenge, to the sector in terms of how we think things can be done differently and better. And there may always be a need for that, because I said at the beginning, this is not an acute problem to fix. Rather, we need to be continuously reflecting on how we work and how we can do better. And in that respect, there may be, I don't want to say always a role for UKRN, but a longer term role for UKRN. We may move past our current focus on open research, but there will be new challenges in the future, which we may not even know of yet, that will require a similarly constructive but challenging approach.
Well, just on that, that perhaps segues nicely into a question when I mentioned on our Microsoft team earlier that I was talking to you. So Professor Kat Davies, who I think you'll know, our Dean of Research Culture, I guess is a similar role to the one that you have. So she mentioned she'd spoken to you briefly, a brief exchange, she said, around open grants, and that Bristol has guidance. I know that's something Kat's been particularly interested in, and sharing grants, and something that people are perhaps a little less willing to do given the competitive nature of academia. I mean, perhaps finish on any thoughts around that? Yeah,
so I think, there's always a role for healthy competition. I'm not against competition per se, but I do think that at an individual level and at an institutional level, we've perhaps become excessively competitive, hyper competitive. And actually, there are some areas where we can work more collaboratively in a way that benefits everybody. Not everything is zero sum, in other words. And one of those is by sharing examples of successful grants. So we have a system internally within Bristol where, with all the appropriate consents and protections in place, and a certain amount of redacting of things like salaries and other sensitive information, people who have successful grants or fellowships allow those to be shared with other people who are applying to similar mechanisms, so they can see what a successful grant looks like. And I think increasingly one of the areas I'm keen to explore is the extent to which we can take that principle of transparency and the healthiness of that transparency that underpins the open research agenda, and apply that more generally to how universities work, I think we can endeavor to be much more transparent about our decision-making, our underlying processes, in how we work, in a way that I think will give people more trust in their own institution and will create a sense of trustworthiness about the research process in terms of open research, but about how we work more generally as a sector in terms of our other processes.
No, that's great. I mean, just before we do finish it, we just I was just thinking that the UK nature of UKRN, and this is an international movement, though, right? Is it the equivalent or similar?
It is now. So, I mean, you mentioned how fast we've grown and how recognised we are in a relatively short space of time, and that's been really, really fantastic. Actually, I mean, I genuinely have been blown away by the extent to which that energy has carried us forward. That I talked about, that grassroots energy in particular, and how funders and publishers and others have responded. But you're right; it's an international, research is an international endeavour, and one of the things that we've seen is the growth in national reproducibility networks in other countries and regions. So we have those in about 20 countries, most of which are in Europe, but we also have a regional reproducibility network in Africa, where individual countries don't have the critical mass to form their own reproducibility networks, but at the regional level, there is that critical mass, and that's led by Emmanuel Boake from Ghana, and is a great opportunity for us to then be able to share some of the resources that we're developing around, for example, open research, with institutions that, again, may not have the resources to develop that kind of thing themselves. So we now have a global coordination piece, if you like, that extends beyond just the national picture. And many funders, and in particular other organizations like publishers, work at a supranational level. There are supranational organizations like the Horizon Programme across Europe, like UNESCO, that we are joining up with. And so there is that opportunity to provide a degree of global coordination in these efforts as well.
Oh, great. That's of real interest to me, actually, because we're doing quite a lot of work, and I'm personally interested in knowledge equity issues, versus the global north versus the global south, that kind of thing. So I'll have to look into that in more detail, but that's great. Thanks very much for your time, Marcus, and great to talk to you. And yeah, thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to the Research Culture Uncovered podcast. Please subscribe so you never miss out on our brand new episodes. And if you're enjoying the discussions, give us some love by dropping a 5-star rating and written review, as it helps other research culturists find us. And please share with a friend and show them how to subscribe. Thanks for listening, and here's to you and your research culture.